indigenous YouTube, IndigiTube, was a very innovative idea that indigenous people put up to showcase the videos that they make. And anyone can log into it. If you Google IndigiTube, you'll find it very easily. So how do we define indigenous media then? Here I'm looking at the ways in which indigenous people themselves talk about it. They call it the electronic message stick. In very years gone by, messages were carved onto sticks and carried by indigenous people between various tribal groups to send messages. Now they do it electronically. People use the term our voice or the bush telegraph. In Australia, all of that part of Australia which is away from the coast is generally referred to as the bush. It's kind of the remote areas. And the bush telegraph is one way in which people define their own media. As one person told me, it's blackfella, talking to blackfella. And that simply means blackfella is a term that Aboriginal people themselves use to describe themselves. It can be used and has been used in a very derogatory way by Westerners, by Europeans. But when Indigenous people talk about themselves, they often use the term blackfella, which means I'm Indigenous. It's a form of identity which, coming from Indigenous people, means something very different from when it's used by non-Indigenous people. But also, I think importantly, it's the role of Indigenous media helps to create what I've called an Indigenous public sphere. And here I'm drawing on some of the work of Jürgen Habermas and others who have theorised the way in which communication around communities takes place. But certainly there is an Indigenous public sphere, and as Mark Deutzer has sort of argued, it creates a more engaged and participatory culture. And again, that's an argument for the strength of Indigenous media and the power that it can have in those communities. This is just a rough sketch of some of the major Indigenous media production sites in Australia. There are many more than that. I couldn't fit them all on the map, but essentially Indigenous radio produces each week 1,400 hours of programming each week is produced on Indigenous radio around Australia. There are 25 regional radio stations which Indigenous communities use. In addition, and some of these names here are included here, that there are more than 100 remote Indigenous broadcasting services. And these are small community radio stations where local communities produce programs, often in their own languages, about local issues. Very, very important. In addition to that, there are another 90 radio programs on community radio around Australia which include Indigenous material. So there's a lot of talk on the airwaves in Australia by Indigenous people about Indigenous issues, but it's almost entirely in the community sector. There is hardly anything that goes to air on the mainstream sector in Australia. There are 2 Indigenous television channels, the National Indigenous TV Network, NITV, which started in 2007. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And there's also the Indigenous Community Television Network, which is a remote service, a pioneering network which services those communities that are a long way away from the coast. So just quickly, just wanted to run through some of these broad ideas. Oh, sorry, I'll just go back ahead of myself there. Indigenous media, I think, if we look at it in global terms, I think we can see a couple of reasons why it's becoming so popular and so necessary. The declining engagement in politics of people generally, I think, has caused concern throughout certainly the Western world, and I suspect, and after reading some of the headlines from Taiwanese politics in recent days, there are similar issues here, that people perhaps are becoming less supportive of politics when they feel as though they're not being listened to. And I think Indigenous people, of course, have felt that for a long time too. I think there's a need for more face-to-face interaction too to establish the processes of democracy. And more I think we're seeing the democratic process removed from the community, and Indigenous people as disempowered tend to be ones who feel very much that they are pushed to one side and are left out of the conversation. And as Nick Caldry argues, that media consumption plays an essential role in sustaining public connection. If media don't exist, and if media, particularly in the voices of the people who are producing it, don't exist, well then public connection is going to be more and more difficult, and Indigenous people will remain separate from mainstream society, which is not what many of us want, I think. Clearly there are international covenants which argue for Indigenous media, and here the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states very clearly that Indigenous people have the right to their own media, their own sources of media. Interestingly, Australia only signed this in 2009. Indigenous media had been around for a lot longer than that, but 2009, which seems like yesterday. So it shows that governments really are very, very slow at recognising the importance of Indigenousness and how this is a central part of our culture. I think the other key issue that I wanted to raise today, and one thing I could say after working for almost 3 decades in Indigenous media research in Australia, is that the main outcome of all of this from the mouths of the people who are producing media is that it is empowering. Empowerment is a critical community tool. If people feel empowered, then it increases their social and emotional well-being. And we see all of the outcomes of poor social and emotional well-being in high rates of domestic violence, high rates of substance abuse, and I'm sure that that is the case in Taiwanese Indigenous communities as well, where particularly young people see they have no future. What do they do? How can they direct their lives? What futures do they have? And so social and emotional well-being should be one of the primary objectives of any media system. We've found that there's strong evidence to suggest that the Indigenous media sector in Australia is providing that very important base for improving social and emotional well-being of communities. People able to get on the radio and talk about mental illness, talk about substance abuse, talk about violence, to share their experiences, to be open about those kinds of issues, and is proving to be a very, very powerful way in which communities are empowering themselves through their own media. So very, very important, I think. I mentioned before the idea of the Indigenous public sphere, and there I've drawn on a few different theorists here to argue this. I won't go through them in depth because I deal with them more in the paper, but essentially arguing that the broad idea of the public sphere can be broken down. In Nancy Fraser's work, some of you may be interested or may be familiar with her work, she's argued that if we think of the public sphere as a series of interlocking and overlapping smaller spheres, and the Indigenous public sphere, I'm arguing, can be seen as something like that. It crosses over into the mainstream public sphere, but it's created, maintained and sustained by Indigenous activity, and Indigenous media play a very critical role in that process. One thing I wanted to point to, and that's the last point on the screen, that another, I think, clear summation that I would make after working in with Indigenous media for 30 years, almost 30 years, is that there's a clear absence of a barrier between audiences and producers in Indigenous media in Australia. The same is evident in Canada, where I've done some work as well. And this, I think, distinguishes Indigenous media production from almost any other form of media production. If we look at the community area, it's as though the audiences for Indigenous media are also the producers of that media. And I think that's a very important theoretical and practical point, that where Indigenous communities are able to adopt traditional knowledge management systems and transfer that to the structure of their own media production, then it's become sustainable, they feel ownership of it, and it gives them this lack of a barrier. People feel as if there is no barrier between the producer and the audience, and I think that's quite an interesting characteristic of this particular media. These points were made by Ricardo Ramirez, who's worked with Indigenous communities in Canada for some time, and he argues essentially there that the importance of working with Indigenous communities is to really try to move away from the government preoccupation with looking always at making a business case for something like an Indigenous media enterprise. It's not a business case, it should be a development case, or perhaps even seen as an investment in the future. This is something that government policymakers, I think, are very slow to respond to, particularly in Australia. And I think we need to look at the way in which policy is made, which I'll return to a little later on. But I think the key point he makes there is that no single person or no single actor holds the key to the success of negotiations over setting up a sustainable Indigenous media policy regime. Okay, well, in the Australian context then, there are, I guess, 4 points to make before we start looking at some images of Indigenous media around Australia. Tensions do exist in the sector, we can't pretend they don't. There are tensions between the urban Indigenous groups and those who are still living a largely traditional lifestyle in remote parts of the country. That surfaced in various ways, and I'll talk about that again later too. It's often talked about as a case of the quiet voices, the people from the remote areas, much more polite, much quieter at the negotiating table, compared with the loud voices of the perhaps better educated, urban dwelling Indigenous people who often have their voices heard. Is this microphone still working? Maybe it's. Can you still hear? Okay, thanks. The other thing to remember, I think, in this is the third sector, which is the community sector and Indigenous media, is often always in government policy pushed to one side. So it's a struggle for communities who are operating in the third sector, the community sector, to have their voices heard in national policy debates. Okay, so let's have a bit of a tour of some of the regions in Australia where I've worked, and just to give you a sense of the kind of locations. This is in the Torres Strait. This is right up in the far north of Australia, really as close to Papua New Guinea as it is to the Australian continent. And here you see a couple of Torres Strait Islanders, and that's their local broadcasting unit, which they use to send messages and music and report news to the rest of the island. I went up there in 1992 to look at the way in which the impact that television had on those island communities, and I guess if there was one thing I could summarise from that, it meant that those people who used to go out fishing all day were coming home to watch the soap opera Days of Our Lives at lunchtime, and so it actually changed the way in which people approached their work in that community. But it certainly was having an impact on young people and the way that they operate. Here on Palm Island, this is an island where 23 different tribal groups were forced to live because of, I guess, the theft of their land by settlement. It's a very mixed community, a beautiful location. The island just to the north there is one of the most expensive tourist resorts in Australia, and yet Palm Island, where Aboriginal communities live, has a long history of violence and alcohol abuse, because these 23 different tribal groups were forced together to live in a very confined space, substandard housing, and people are surprised that these communities struggle to survive in such an environment. But the radio station on Palm Island has done a fantastic job of bringing the community together, to now enabling people to talk about their issues rather than to misunderstand each other. This was one of the many government meetings with Indigenous people in the lead up to the National Indigenous Television Service here at a community called Woorabinda, which is near Rockhampton in central Queensland. And basically the government policymakers, that the woman with the glasses in the middle there, she's explaining to people at that very time that unless they accepted the money that the government had given them, that NITV would not happen. At that very meeting, she said, we have $48 million. If you don't accept this, NITV will not exist. It was a very fiery, a very difficult meeting, that one. In northern Queensland, in northern Australia, Cape York Peninsula, you can see they're very remote areas, not many towns.